"Get off my lawn!" James Cartwright barked, his voice cutting through the quiet suburban evening like a crack of thunder. Standing on his porch, the retired Marine glared at the group of young men sprawled across his perfectly manicured grass, smoking and laughing as if they belonged there. Their cigarette butts littered the ground, tiny insults scattered across the yard he worked so hard to maintain. One of the men, a tall figure with a cocky smirk and a cigarette dangling from his lips, turned toward James. "Relax, old man," he said, blowing a cloud of smoke into the air. "We're just hanging out." "You're trespassing," James shot back, his voice sharp. "This isn't a public park. Move it, now." The men exchanged glances, their smirks growing wider. One of them muttered something in Spanish, prompting the others to laugh. James's fists tightened at his sides. He didn't need to understand the words to feel the disrespect. The tall man rose slowly, deliberately crushing his cigarette under his boot. "We'll leave when we're ready," he said, stepping toward the edge of the lawn. "Not because you tell us to." James felt his blood boil, a lifetime of discipline barely holding his temper in check. "You've got 5 seconds," he said, his voice cold. "Or I'm calling the police." The laughter stopped. The tall man took another step forward, locking eyes with James. "Go ahead," he said with a sneer. "We'll be gone before they show up." For a long moment, the two men stood in a tense standoff, the air between them crackling with unspoken challenge. James finally stepped back onto his porch, unwilling to escalate further, but seething inside. As he turned away, the men's laughter erupted again, following him like a taunt. James slammed the door behind him, his heart pounding with frustration and fury. He had no idea that this simple confrontation would spiral into something much darker, an encounter that would test every ounce of his resolve and change his quiet suburban life forever. The morning after the confrontation, James awoke to the sunlight streaming through his bedroom window, but the tension from the previous evening hadn't faded. He walked out to his porch, steaming coffee in hand, and his jaw tightened as he scanned his lawn. The grass bore the telltale signs of cigarette burns, and a few crumpled butts still dotted the ground. He set his coffee down with a sharp clink and began picking up the trash, muttering under his breath. James knew he couldn't let this slide. He called the local police, filing a report about the trespassing. The officer who took his statement over the phone seemed indifferent. "We can send someone by to patrol the area," the officer said. "But without identifying information, there's not much else we can do." James hung up, frustration gnawing at him. The men weren't just disrespecting his property, they were making him feel powerless. And for a man who had spent decades as a Marine, fighting for control and discipline, that was a hard pill to swallow. Later that day, James decided to take a trip to the corner store to clear his mind. He moved briskly through the aisles, picking up a loaf of bread and a gallon of milk. As he approached the register, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. His instincts, honed over years in the military, prickled at the back of his neck. Outside, the streetlights flickered as James made his way down the sidewalk with his bag of groceries. The uneasy feeling followed him, growing stronger with every step. Then he heard it, footsteps behind him, faint but unmistakable. James turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of movement in the corner of his eye. It was them, the same group of men from his lawn, their faces shadowed under the dim light. His pulse quickened, and he tightened his grip on the grocery bag, his body tensing as adrenaline surged through him. "Hey, old man," one of them called out, his voice mocking. "You still mad about your lawn?" James kept walking, his heart pounding. He didn't respond, hoping they'd lose interest and move on. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they surrounded him in the narrow alleyway between the store and the main street. The tall man from the night before stepped forward, his smirk as sharp as ever. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" he sneered, stepping into James's path. "I don't want any trouble," James said, his voice firm but steady. He dropped the grocery bag to free his hands, readying himself for whatever came next. "Too late for that," the man said, and before James could react, the first punch landed. It struck his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. Another blow followed, this one to his jaw, sending him stumbling against the alley wall. The attack was fast and brutal. Fists and kicks came from all directions, each one hitting with precision. James fought back instinctively, years of training guiding his movements, but he was outnumbered and overpowered. The men jeered as they struck him, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. Finally, as quickly as it had started, the beating stopped. The men stepped back, their laughter fading as they disappeared into the shadows. James collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his body aching with every breath. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, and his ribs throbbed with sharp pain. It took all his strength to push himself to his feet and limp home. By the time he reached his front door, his clothes were torn and his hands were trembling. He sank into a chair, staring at the floor as the reality of what had happened sank in. The next morning, James reported the assault to the police. This time, they seemed more interested, taking detailed notes and asking questions about the men. But when James described them, the officer's expression shifted. "Do you know if they're locals?" he asked. James shook his head. "I don't know. I've only seen them around the neighborhood recently." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "If they're undocumented, it could be difficult to track them down," he explained. "We'll do our best, but without proper identification or a fixed address, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack." James's frustration boiled over. "So they just get away with it?" he demanded, his voice rising. "They attacked me, and you're saying there's nothing you can do?" "We're not saying that," the officer replied, his tone measured. "But these cases can be complicated. We'll keep an eye out." James left the station feeling angry and defeated. The police's words felt like a dismissal, and he couldn't shake the feeling that justice wouldn't come unless he found a way to make it happen himself. For weeks, James kept to himself, avoiding the corner store and sticking to the safety of his home. But the memory of the attack haunted him, each bruise and ache a reminder of his helplessness. He scanned the streets every time he left the house, his eyes searching for the men who had taken so much from him. One evening, as he drove through a neighboring town, James spotted a familiar face. It was the tall man from the group, walking casually down the sidewalk with a cigarette in hand. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel as a surge of anger coursed through him. He parked his truck and watched from a distance, noting the address where the man entered a small, rundown house. James sat there for a long time, torn between his desire for justice and the knowledge that taking matters into his own hands could have serious consequences. Finally, he drove home, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't trust the police to handle this. He had to find a way to ensure these men faced the consequences of their actions. James sat outside the small house, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had thought about this moment for weeks, his mind replaying the attack in the alley over and over, the mocking laughter, the blows to his ribs, and the way they had left him crumpled and broken on the ground haunted him every night. Now, as he watched the tall man step outside for a smoke, the weight of his anger mixed with the gravity of what he was about to do. Taking a deep breath, James opened the truck door and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. His military training guided his steps, steady and deliberate. The man looked up, startled, as James approached, but the smirk he wore during their first encounter was gone. Recognition dawned on his face, quickly replaced by alarm. "You remember me?" James said, his voice low and cold. The man's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. "Look, man," he started, his tone defensive. "I didn't mean—" "Save it," James interrupted, pulling a small handgun from his jacket. "You didn't mean it when you and your buddies beat me senseless in that alley?" The man froze, his hands raised. "I don't want trouble." "You brought trouble," James growled. "Now you're going to face it." The loud crack of the gunshot echoed through the empty street. The man collapsed, clutching his leg, blood pooling beneath him. James didn't flinch as he stood over him. He wasn't there to kill, only to send a message. He pulled out his phone and dialed the police, reporting the location and the man's involvement in the assault. When officers arrived, they uncovered the man's illegal status. It didn't take long for authorities to trace his connections, leading to the deportation of the others involved in the attack. Justice wasn't clean or simple, but James felt a grim satisfaction knowing the men who had terrorized him were finally gone. As he stood on his porch days later, the neighborhood quiet and still, James reflected on the cost of his actions. He had protected his home, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. Still, for the first time in weeks, he felt safe.